As we begin our study of Ephesians, it's important to provide a bit of background to put Paul's epistle in its historical and cultural context. To give you an idea of how important this introductory material is, I've devoted 3 days to introducing this epistle. You see, the Bible is an eminently practical book. And the Bible is primarily written to Christians to teach us how to live. That's one reason the epistle is addressed specifically to the church at Ephesus. That is, to help them understand how God wanted them to live in that pagan culture. Well, you and I live in a pagan culture as well. By understanding something about that culture, we can understand why God inspired Paul to write some of the things he did to that church in that cultural setting. By understanding how the Christians in Ephesus applied the principles of God's Word in their cultural setting, we can also understand how God wants us to apply His principles in our cultural setting. That brings me to another point. Although this is Paul's epistle to the Ephesians, it's also God's epistle to the Ephesians. Scholars like to say, well, Paul said this, Paul said that. That's just what Paul said. But the truth is, it's not just what Paul said, it's also what God inspired Paul to write. And that's important. But not only did God inspire it for the Ephesians, but God also preserved it for us. Remember, this is not just what Paul said, it's what God said. But it's not just what God said, it's also what God says. So with these things in mind, let's dive into some introductory concerns about this wonderful book. Today, in the first of 3 sections of introductory material, we're going to look at the Roman culture generally, along with the political and religious environment, and then just a little bit about the city itself. I am aware that you have already had studies dealing with the background of the New Testament, the Roman Empire, and so forth. I do not want to duplicate that material here, but I do want to remind you of some of the salient points that have bearing on the writings of Paul. One is the political scene. By the time of the New Testament, the Roman Empire had peaked out and was already on the decline. Rome still controlled most of the known world at the time, but massive corruption and immorality throughout the government and the acceptance or toleration of generally all sorts of socially reprehensible practices led to a cheapening of human life and a lowering of personal values. Jealousy and paranoia among the emperors and local rulers made Rome's collapse inevitable. It was only a matter of time. The rulers of the empire during the days of Paul were these. You had Tiberius, whose dates were 14 to 37. Augustus died in the age of 14, and his adopted son Tiberius came to power. He proved to be a very capable ruler and demonstrated a genuine concern for the empire. He ran the government in an austere and frugal style. In fact, he even lowered taxes on the people. As a rule, his appointments to government positions stayed for longer than usual tenures, which provided stability in his administration. Unfortunately, Tiberius was unpopular with the Roman Senate. That resulted in unrest at the very heart of the political arena. Most day-to-day operations of the empire had been entrusted to the prefect of the imperial guard, one person named Sejanus. Sejanus brought many people up on charges of treason, thus playing on Tiberius' naturally suspicious nature. Over time, it became very important to be called a friend of Caesar. Sejanus eventually encouraged Tiberius to move to the island of Capri in AD 26, the same year in which Pilate, a protege of Sejanus, was appointed. From Capri, the emperor ran the empire by correspondence. Sejanus accused so many of treason that eventually Tiberius became suspicious of Sejanus himself and had him executed in AD 31. Not much is known of Tiberius' last 6 years. He died in AD 37. The next ruler was Gaius, also nicknamed Caligula. His dates run from AD 37 to 41, a rather short tenure. Caligula was the grandson of Germanicus, one of Rome's leading generals, and was a nephew of Tiberius. Caligula became legendary for his ridiculous decisions. For example, he proclaimed himself a god and ordered a bust of himself erected in the Jewish temple. That order was never carried out. However, he also had his horse appointed as Roman senator. He was also ruthless to the nobles of Rome, so much so, in fact, that he was assassinated in AD 41 by the Praetorian Guard, which is why his orders regarding the Jewish temple were never followed. Caligula thought nothing of having some of his henchmen murder a wealthy Roman family, confiscate their property, and sell it to pay off his gambling debts. This is the same Caligula who impregnated his sister and later ripped the baby from her womb, killing it. The next ruler was a person named Claudius. He ruled from AD 41 to 54. Claudius was Caligula's uncle. Now you can tell all of this is a family affair. After the Praetorian Guard assassinated Caligula, they rampaged through the palace and found Claudius hiding in fear. The guards mocked him and ridiculed him, but thinking they could control him, they then appointed him as emperor. This was a major departure from tradition, for up to that time, the emperor was appointed by the Roman Senate, not the Praetorian Guard. As it turned out, Claudius was a wise ruler and a good administrator. For his appointments, he turned to the freedmen rather than to the nobles. Now, freedmen were former slaves who had served their masters so well that they were granted freedom. Claudius also extended Roman citizenship to others who would not have been able to qualify otherwise. Claudius' death in AD 54 left a significant vacancy in the affairs of Rome and its empire. The last ruler, the one that takes us through the end of the New Testament era, was Nero, at least through Paul's time anyway. Nero reigned from AD 54 to 68. While Nero's reign began calmly and responsibly, it left a violent and bloody legacy. He was a very able administrator, but he would tolerate no opposition. He was intensely jealous of everyone and jealous of his throne. Much like Caligula, to pay for his sensual excesses and gambling debts, he falsely accused wealthy Romans of treason, condemned them to be executed, and their properties confiscated. His desire to eliminate those who helped him to power led him to murder his mother, Agrippina, and his wife, Octavia. As far as the religious scene is concerned, as you probably know, the world of the New Testament abounded with all kinds of religions, cults, and philosophies. With all the spiritual confusion, it is of little surprise that the people of that day were very dissatisfied with the religious climate. The many theories about the nature of God and man resulted in the decay of ethical and moral absolutes. Their corrupt minds and indecent behavior gave the area a reputation for depravity that was very well deserved. Richard Neiswanger observes, by the 1st century AD, both the masses and the educated had the uneasy feeling that their religions and metaphysical inquiries had failed. The deities, as described by Homer, had not only been immoral in their own behavior, but also were of little aid to those who prayed to them. The tale of gods being involved in brawling, kidnapping, rape, murder, mutilation, and other atrocities naturally shocked sensitive persons and could not serve as models of ethical behavior. The gods themselves were unable to control their own destinies, much less deliver man from the forces of what they considered to be fate. There were three primary ethical systems of thought that arose during the intertestamental period, and they held sway during the New Testament era. They were Cynicism, Stoicism, and Epicureanism. Let's look at these one at a time. Cynicism was founded by Diogenes of Sinope in 320 BC. He was a student of Antisthenes, who would attack ideas with which he disagreed with a particularly sarcastic and malicious tongue. Plato referred to Diogenes as Socrates gone mad. For the Cynic, the goal in life was self satisfaction and self sufficiency. That was known as the autarkia. They advocated renouncing everything so that they might decrease their needs and thus attain self sufficiency. That led to an asceticism, and that asceticism had a certain appeal in some Christian circles. The next major philosophy was that of Stoicism. Stoicism began with Zeno's teaching around 300 BC. It's derived from the name of the porches, the stoa, from the public buildings where Zeno taught. It was well known throughout the Greco Roman world. In fact, the emperor, Marcus Aurelius himself, was a well known Stoic. The Stoics were originally interested in cosmology, natural laws of different forms, and they maintained that all things come from one basic element of fire and would eventually return to fire in some great cataclysmic event, and then the cycle would start all over again. They also held, now this is interesting, they also held that there was an all pervasive force that organized and sustained everything, shades of Star Wars, and they called this force the Logos. They held that this Logos is in man and makes up the human soul. Therefore, to live according to reason is to live according to the natural order of things, and this is good. Conscious obedience to natural law liberates a man from fear and concern about external circumstances over which he has no control, but which are still rules by nature's laws. The good life, then, is one in which reason, not passion, rules, and peace of mind and harmony with nature consequently prevail. Now, that's how they thought about it. The next philosophy, it was also very influential, is that of Epicureanism, named after its founder, Epicurus. Epicureans relied on a natural sensory experience for knowledge and their philosophy of life. Epicurus taught that all things, including people, are made up of atoms. The idea was that when these atoms break apart, man ceases to exist. Therefore, there is no immortality to which they might look forward. Likewise, there is no God to whom all are accountable. These philosophies were not interested in determining ultimate reality in nature or in discovering some God somewhere. They were inherently humanistic in that they desired to determine how one might live a virtuous and worthwhile life. However, the people had grown weary of philosophy and longed for a religion that involved a personal relationship with deity. Hence, the often overwhelming reception of the gospel by the average citizen naturally followed. From this point, let's think about the city of Ephesus. Ephesus was a very strategic city and the commercial center of Asia Minor. It was located on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. It was also a significant religious center, famous for its temple to Diana. Diana is the Roman name, Artemis is the Greek name. This temple was considered to be one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. Paul provided for the foundations of the church at Ephesus on his return from his second missionary journey. On his third missionary tour, he stopped in Ephesus and stayed there for more than 3 years, most likely from AD 54 to 57. From this point, then, in our next session, we will look at Paul the Apostle himself.